Sarah had always believed in the sanctity of marriage. For 7 years, she and Mark had built a life together, a home filled with laughter, quiet routines, and the kind of love that, while familiar, had begun to dull at the edges. Mark, an engineer by trade, spent long hours buried in projects, often bringing work home. Conversations had become transactional, grocery lists, bill reminders, and half-hearted goodnights. It wasn't always this way. She remembered when his eyes lit up at the sight of her, how they used to steal moments of intimacy even in the busiest of days. But somewhere between work stress and life's obligations, the warmth had faded, leaving behind a comfortable but lifeless companionship. Sarah told herself this was normal. That all marriages settled. That passion, like a candle, couldn't burn forever. Then came David. David Prescott, the regional director of her firm, had a presence that commanded attention. Where Mark was methodical and reserved, David was charismatic and unpredictable. He spoke with a quiet confidence, his words deliberate, his gaze piercing. He was the kind of man who could turn a simple meeting into a moment that lingered in the mind long after it ended. Sarah had never thought of him beyond professionalism until he started noticing her. It was subtle at first. A lingering glance during meetings, an offhand compliment about her work ethic, a shared joke when no one else was listening. Then, the attention deepened, small gestures that seemed insignificant but sent ripples through her carefully composed life. He remembered details about her that even Mark had long since overlooked: how she preferred her coffee, the books she kept on her desk, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was lost in thought. One evening, as the office emptied and she gathered her things, David leaned against the doorway of her office. "Working late again?" he asked, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Someone has to keep things running," she replied, forcing a light-hearted tone. He stepped closer, just enough to blur the lines of personal space. "It doesn't go unnoticed, you know. I see how hard you work. You deserve more credit than you get." A simple sentence, yet it cracked something inside her, something fragile, something starved. She laughed, though it came out uneven. "That's kind of you to say." He held her gaze a beat longer than necessary before nodding. "Just stating the truth." As he walked away, Sarah exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath. That night, as she lay beside Mark in bed, his back turned to her in sleep, she replayed the moment in her mind. The way David's voice had dipped just slightly when he spoke to her, the way he had made her feel seen, acknowledged, desired. For the first time in years, her heart beat faster for something other than routine. And that terrified her. The first time it happened, Sarah told herself it was a mistake. It had been an unusually long day, back-to-back meetings, an urgent client presentation, and a dinner event the firm was hosting at an upscale hotel. By the time the last guest left, Sarah's feet ached in her heels, and exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. David, ever the composed leader, had loosened his tie, a rare hint of fatigue showing in the way he rolled his shoulders. "You look like you could use a drink," he remarked, holding up 2 fingers to the bartender. Sarah hesitated but then nodded. "Just one," she said, as if setting a limit could safeguard her from something she wasn't ready to name. They sat in a quiet corner of the lounge, the dim lighting casting shadows across David's face. Conversation flowed easily, too easily, work talk dissolving into personal confessions, shared frustrations, and laughter that felt unrestrained, effortless. Then, somewhere between a sip of whiskey and a self-deprecating joke about their workload, his hand found hers. A deliberate touch, not accidental. A question, not an answer. She should have pulled away. Instead, she looked at their entwined fingers, felt the warmth of his palm, and realized just how starved she had been for this connection, attention, something that made her feel alive. "You know this is dangerous," she murmured, though her grip didn't loosen. David exhaled a quiet laugh. "The best things usually are." The next moment unraveled in a blur of choices she refused to analyze. The elevator ride silent, charged. The hotel room door clicking shut behind them. The press of his lips against hers, urgent yet controlled, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as she had. Every touch ignited something inside her, something that had been dormant for years. The way his hands traced the curve of her back, the way he whispered her name against her skin, it was intoxicating. For the first time in forever, she wasn't a wife, an employee, or someone's second thought. She was wanted. When it was over, reality settled over her like a heavy fog. She lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, her heartbeat a frantic drum in her chest. David turned to her, tracing lazy patterns on her arm. No regrets. She forced a smile, the taste of guilt already creeping in. None, she lied. The next morning, she returned home to find Mark asleep on the couch, an empty coffee mug beside him. Guilt clenched her stomach, but when he stirred, he simply smiled and kissed her forehead, oblivious to the weight she now carried. Sarah told herself it was a mistake. Then it happened again. Sarah had always believed she could control this. That what she and David shared existed in a separate, untouchable world, one that would never bleed into her real life. But secrets, like cracks in glass, had a way of spreading. At first, it was subtle. A missed call from Mark while she was with David, the sharp pang of guilt when she saw his name flash across her screen. A knowing glance from a coworker who lingered too long when Sarah and David exchanged hushed words in the office hallway. Then, the close calls started. One evening, as she sat across from Mark at the dinner table, her phone vibrated against the wood. She reached for it instinctively, then hesitated. It was past 10, David wouldn't be texting her now. Would he? Mark looked up from his plate. Aren't you going to check that? Her pulse quickened. She forced a smile. It's probably just an office update. Nothing urgent. But when she picked up the phone later, her stomach clenched. David, I miss you. Can you sneak away? She deleted the message, her hands trembling. This was reckless. Careless. And yet, the thrill of it still burned beneath her skin. The next morning, whispers followed her as she walked into the office. Two co-workers, Lisa and Ben, fell silent the moment she passed their desks. A knowing smirk flickered across Lisa's lips. Sarah's throat tightened. Something interesting, she asked, forcing her voice to stay even. Ben shifted awkwardly. Lisa, however, leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Oh, nothing. Just, you and David seem to be working really closely these days. Sarah felt the ground beneath her tilt. She scoffed, aiming for indifference. He's my boss. Of course, we work closely. Lisa's smile didn't waver. Of course. That night, Mark was waiting for her when she got home. He was sitting on the couch, a crease between his brows, his phone in his hands. Sarah, he began, voice measured, careful. Can we talk? Her heart pounded against her ribs. Of course. What's wrong? He hesitated, then turned his phone toward her. On the screen was a photo, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Ha! David. Leaving the office together, his hand resting just a little too comfortably on the small of her back. Someone sent this to me, Mark said, watching her reaction. Is there something you want to tell me? A cold wave of panic crashed over her. Denial sat heavy on her tongue, ready to be spoken. But looking into Mark's eyes that had once held nothing but trust, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed lie begin to crumble. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Mark, I can explain. His jaw tightened. Then start explaining. Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way to soften the truth, to twist it into something Mark could accept. But the photo on his phone was undeniable. Mark, it's not what it looks like, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were cold now, calculating. Then tell me. What is it? She hesitated. A single lie could still salvage this, but something in Mark's expression stopped her. 4 years, he had trusted her without question, had given her the benefit of the doubt. Now, she saw the weight of betrayal settling into his features, and she realized no excuse would undo this. Tears welled in her eyes. I made a mistake. Mark exhaled sharply, as if the words physically struck him. He nodded, more to himself than to her. How long? Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. A few months. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, she thought he might yell. But he didn't. He simply stood, ran a hand over his face, and let out a hollow laugh. I should have seen it, he muttered. The late nights, the sudden change in you. He shook his head. God, I was such an idiot. You weren't, she said quickly. This was my fault, Mark. Not yours. He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw it, the breaking point. The moment love gave way to something colder, more distant. I don't even know who you are anymore. A sob escaped her. Mark, please. He raised a hand, cutting her off. I need time, he said, his voice hoarse. To think. To decide what comes next. She nodded, knowing she had no right to ask for anything more. The next morning, Mark was gone. A note on the counter, short, to the point. I need space. Don't call me. At work, David greeted her with a knowing smirk, but Sarah couldn't return it. The thrill, the excitement, it had all soured. She saw him now for what he was, a man who had never risked anything. A man who would move on untouched while she watched her life collapse around her. When she told him it was over, he didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he had expected it. Take care of yourself, Sarah, he said, already turning away. As she walked out of his office, a hollow emptiness settled in her chest. That night, she lay in bed alone, staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had led her here. The love she had taken for granted. The trust she had shattered. She had chased something fleeting, something that had never truly belonged to her. And now, all she had left was the ruin it had left behind.